While you're standing in a gas station aisle reading ingredient labels on beef jerky, sodium nitrite, corn syrup solids, monosodium glutamate, hydrolyzed soy protein, Cree and Métis hunters were carrying blocks of preserved meat across the frozen grasslands that stayed edible for 20 years without a single chemical additive. No refrigeration, no vacuum-sealed packaging, no expiration date anxiety, just dried bison, rendered fat, and an understanding of water activity that modern food science has spent the last century trying to replicate with a cocktail of preservatives. The engineering gap between pemmican and modern jerky reveals exactly how far we've fallen from functional food preservation. Take a piece of commercial beef jerky and try to bend it. It flexes, it folds, it stretches slightly before tearing, the texture somewhere between leather and rubber. Now take a strip of traditionally dried bison meat, the kind made without liquid smoke or cure accelerators, and apply the same pressure. It shatters, clean break, audible crack. The difference in that sound is diagnostic. The snap confirms something specific. Water activity below 0.2. Water activity measures the energy status of water in a material, essentially how available that water is for bacteria, yeasts, and molds to use for metabolism. Free water that microbes can access has high water activity. Bound water, locked into molecular structures or removed entirely, has low water activity. Bacteria need water activity above 0.86 to grow. Yeasts require above 0.80. Molds can survive down to 0.70. Below 0.60, microbial life becomes physically impossible. There is not enough free water to support cellular metabolism. The organism cannot reproduce, it cannot feed, it dies or goes dormant. The brittle crack stage, what Plains processors recognized as the preservation threshold, indicates the meat has crossed below 0.2. The proteins have become so dehydrated that the tissue structure fractures rather than deforms. This mechanical test requires no laboratory equipment, no pH strips, no moisture meters, just hands and ears. If it snaps, bacteria cannot survive in it. Modern jerky bends because it retains significantly more moisture. The texture that consumers interpret as quality, that soft, chewy bite, is maintained by keeping water activity just low enough to prevent immediate spoilage, but high enough to preserve palatability. Commercial jerky achieves this balance through humectants, substances that bind water molecules and lower water activity without actually drying the product. Sugar, corn syrup, glycerol, and sorbitol appear on ingredient lists for this exact function. They attach to water molecules through hydrogen bonding, reducing the freedom of that water to participate in bacterial metabolism while keeping the meat soft. Each humectant works slightly differently. Sugar and corn syrup are hygroscopic. They attract and hold water molecules in a bound state. Glycerol forms multiple hydrogen bonds with water, trapping it in a molecular cage. Sorbitol performs the same function with different binding geometry. The result is the same. Water remains in the product but becomes less available for microbial use. This allows manufacturers to achieve a soft, chewy texture while technically claiming shelf stability. The meat feels moist because it is moist. The water has not been removed, it has simply been chemically restrained. But you now have a wet, sugar-laden meat product. The water is still there, bound chemically rather than removed physically. Clostridium botulinum, the bacterium that produces botulinum toxin, thrives in low-oxygen, moist environments. Vacuum-sealed jerky with residual moisture and added sugars is an ideal substrate. The vacuum packaging removes oxygen, creating exactly the anaerobic conditions Clostridium requires. To prevent botulism, manufacturers add sodium nitrite, a compound that inhibits Clostridium growth and maintains the pink, fresh color of the meat by binding to myoglobin. Sodium nitrite works. It prevents botulism poisoning by disrupting the bacteria's iron-sulfur enzymes. But when exposed to high heat or the acidic environment of the stomach, nitrites can react with amino acids to form carcinogenic nitrosamines. The humectant strategy necessitates this chemical intervention. You cannot keep meat soft and wet without also keeping it vulnerable to the exact pathogens that nitrites are designed to kill. Remove the nitrite and the product becomes a botulism risk. Keep the nitrite and you introduce carcinogenic compounds. Each solution creates the need for the next additive in the cascade. Dried meat alone, even at water activity below 0.2, faces two degradation pathways: oxidation and moisture re-entry. Fat oxidizes when exposed to oxygen, producing rancid off flavors and destroying nutritional value. Dried protein can reabsorb moisture from humid air, gradually raising water activity back into the danger zone. Rendered tallow addresses both vulnerabilities through encapsulation. Suet, the hard fat deposits around the kidneys and loins of bison, was selected specifically for rendering because it has a higher melting point than muscle fat and contains fewer impurities. Kidney suet, in particular, has a firmness at room temperature that softer muscle fats and back fat lack. This firmness translates to structural stability in the final product. The fat will not liquefy during transport in warm conditions or become grainy when cooled. The rendering process involves heating suet to approximately 250 degrees Fahrenheit. This temperature boils off the water trapped in fat, cells, separates the connective tissue, which floats as greaves, and produces pure triglyceride chains. The process takes hours. The fat must be stirred periodically to prevent scorching. The greaves are skimmed off as they rise. What remains is clear, golden liquid tallow, pure energy in fluid form. When poured hot over pulverized dried meat, the liquid tallow does not sit on the surface. It saturates the powder completely in seconds. At the microscopic level, it coats every protein particle. It fills the interstitial air gaps between particles. As it cools and solidifies, it forms a continuous hydrophobic matrix that excludes oxygen. Without oxygen contact, fat oxidation cannot proceed, and blocks moisture, as ambient humidity cannot penetrate the lipid barrier to rehydrate the protein inside. You can see this encapsulation visually. Freshly mixed pemmican, before it fully sets, has a paste-like consistency with no visible air pockets. Once cooled, the block is dense and uniform. There are no voids, no fibrous strands, no porous gaps. Contrast this with modern jerky under magnification, a sponge-like matrix of protein fibers with visible air channels running throughout. Those channels allow oxygen penetration and moisture absorption. Pour water over a block of pemmican and it beads on the surface, rolling off like water on wax. The hydrophobic tallow rejects it completely. Pour water over a piece of commercial jerky and watch it absorb. The meat swells, the texture softens. Within minutes, the jerky has gained measurable weight from water uptake. This is why jerky requires sealed packaging with desiccant packets. The material itself cannot resist humidity. The standard ratio was 1 pound of dried meat to 1 pound of rendered tallow measured by weight. Because fat contains 9 kilocalories per gram versus protein's 4 kilocalories per gram, this 50-50 weight ratio yields a final product that is approximately 70% fat by calories. This proportion serves a biochemical function beyond simple energy density. The human liver can only process approximately 25 to 35% of total energy intake from protein before the urea cycle. The metabolic pathway that converts toxic ammonia into excretable urea becomes overloaded. Exceed this threshold and you develop protein poisoning, historically termed rabbit starvation, because it was most commonly observed in trappers surviving on lean game like rabbit or hare during winter. The symptoms are severe: nausea, diarrhea, abdominal distension, weakness, and eventually death. Critically, these symptoms occur even when the individual is consuming adequate calories from protein. The stomach is full, the body is starving. When carbohydrate and fat intake are insufficient, the body converts protein into glucose through gluconeogenesis, an energy-expensive process that taxes the liver, while protein metabolism simultaneously produces ammonia that must be converted to urea. The urea cycle has a rate limit. Push that limit, and ammonia accumulates in the bloodstream, causing hyperammonemia. Vilhjalmur Stefansson, the Arctic explorer who spent years living with Inuit communities, documented this phenomenon directly. He observed that survival on lean caribou meat alone was impossible. Fat was mandatory, not as a luxury, but as a physiological requirement to dilute protein intake below the toxic threshold. Pemmican's 70% fat by calorie ratio keeps protein contribution well below 35% of total energy, preventing urea cycle overload while enabling the body to enter nutritional ketosis, a metabolic state where fatty acids and ketones, rather than glucose, become the primary energy substrates. Modern beef jerky is nearly all protein. A typical commercial product contains 30 to 40 grams of protein per 100 grams, but only 2 to 5 grams of fat. For someone attempting to survive on jerky alone, the scenario these products are marketed for, protein poisoning becomes inevitable. The macronutrient profile is metabolically inadequate for sustained survival despite the caloric content. Before meat becomes pemmican, it must be dried. On the northern plains, this was accomplished through solar drying in summer and smoke curing in cooler or wetter months. Both methods rely on precise environmental control, but smoking introduces an additional layer of preservation chemistry. Wood smoke is a complex chemical fumigant containing hundreds of compounds, 3 categories of which perform preservation functions. Phenolic compounds, primarily guaiacol and syringol, act as antioxidants by donating electrons to free radicals, interrupting the chain reactions that cause fat rancidity. These same phenols disrupt bacterial cell walls by denaturing membrane proteins. Hardwoods like oak, maple, and hickory produce higher concentrations of phenols than softwoods. This is not incidental. Resinous woods like pine, spruce, and fir were deliberately avoided because they contain high levels of terpenes, volatile compounds that produce acrid, bitter smoke without contributing meaningful preservation chemistry. The terpenes overpower the meat's flavor and leave a sticky residue but do not inhibit microbial growth or prevent oxidation. Wood selection was a technical decision, not an aesthetic one. Carbonyls, particularly formaldehyde and acetaldehyde, react with amino groups on proteins through the Maillard reaction, forming the pellicle, a tacky, protective skin on the meat's surface. This pellicle is not visible as a separate layer, but you can feel it. The surface of properly smoked meat has a slight tackiness when touched, distinct from the dry, papery texture of purely sun-dried meat. This skin acts as an additional barrier against oxygen and moisture while contributing to color and flavor development through complex browning reactions. Organic acids, acetic acid and formic acid, deposit on the meat's surface and lower its pH. Most bacteria thrive at neutral pH around 7.0. Smoke deposition drops the surface pH below 5.0, creating an acid mantle where bacterial growth is inhibited. The longer the smoking duration, the deeper this acid penetration. Traditional smoking took place over days, not hours. The meat hung in the smoke stream continuously, accumulating protective compounds in layers. Smoking requires temperature discipline. The fire must be maintained between 80 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to promote moisture evaporation, but cool enough to avoid cooking the meat. This required careful fuel management. Too much wood and the temperature spikes. Too little and the smoke production drops. The ideal setup used a small, smoldering fire with green wood added periodically to generate smoke without flame. If the temperature exceeds 140 degrees, proteins denature and contract, trapping moisture inside the tissue. That trapped moisture keeps water activity too high and the meat spoils. Case hardening occurs when the exterior dries too quickly, forming a moisture-impermeable crust before the interior has finished dehydrating. The tomaabiyadin outside may feel dry and shelf-stable while the inside remains wet and vulnerable to bacterial growth. Cutting into case-hardened meat reveals a dark, dried exterior surrounding a lighter, still moist core. This is preservation failure disguised as preservation success. This is a drying process kept deliberately separate from cooking. Modern industrial jerky is often cooked at 160 degrees Fahrenheit for food safety compliance, then dried afterward. The sequence is reversed, creating exactly the case-hardening problem that low-temperature smoking was designed to prevent. Liquid smoke, the substitute used in most commercial jerky, is condensed pyrolysis products from burning sawdust. The carcinogenic polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are filtered out, leaving primarily flavor compounds, guaiacol and syringol in dissolved form. It contributes no phenolic preservation, no pH modification, no pellicle formation. It is applied as a surface spray or mixed into the meat slurry before extrusion. The actual preservation work in modern jerky is done entirely by sodium nitrite and reduced water activity from humectants. The liquid smoke is theatrical. Pemmican contains 700 to 900 kilocalories per 100 grams, depending on the exact fat to protein ratio. Modern beef jerky contains 250 to 300 kilocalories per 100 grams. In practical terms, you would need to carry 3 pounds of jerky to obtain the same energy available in 1 pound of pemmican. For a voyageur paddling 12 hours per day and burning 4,000 to 5,000 kilocalories, this gap determines operational viability. The Northwest Company and Hudson's Bay Company, fur trade operations in the early 19th century, ran on pemmican produced by Métis and Cree hunters. Canoe brigades could not carry fresh food. It spoiled and was too heavy. They could not stop to hunt or fish every day without losing time and falling behind schedule. A voyageur's routine involved paddling from dawn until mid-morning, stopping briefly for pemmican, then resuming until evening. Distances covered were immense, 30 to 40 miles per day on rivers. Portages added brutal demands, with voyageurs carrying 180 pounds of cargo on their backs across miles of rough terrain between waterways. The energy density difference becomes visible through combustion. Light a piece of pemmican on fire and it burns like a candle. Steady flame, bright yellow, sustained for minutes. The tallow acts as fuel, combusting cleanly and releasing heat continuously. Light a piece of modern jerky and it chars, smolders, releases acrid smoke, but struggles to sustain a flame. The low fat content means insufficient fuel for continuous combustion. The sugar caramelizes and the protein blackens, but the flame dies quickly. Fire does not lie about energy density. Pemmican was packed in 90-pound rawhide bags called taureaux. The rawhide was stretched, scraped, and sun-dried until rigid, then sewn into bags using sinew. Once pemmican was packed and the tallow cooled, the rawhide was moistened and allowed to shrink dry around the cargo, creating a drum-tight seal. These bags could withstand immersion. Historical accounts describe pemmican recovered from submerged canoes that remained perfectly dry inside. The blocks were stackable and dense enough to serve as ballast in canoe hulls, lowering the center of gravity and improving stability in rough water. In 1814, Miles MacDonell, governor of the Red River Colony, issued the Pemmican Proclamation, a decree banning the export of pemmican from the colony. This was an economic blockade equivalent to a modern oil embargo. The Northwest Company's supply chain depended entirely on pemmican from Métis producers. Without it, their voyageurs could not reach the interior trading posts. The proclamation led directly to the Battle of Seven Oaks in 1816, an armed confrontation between Métis pemmican suppliers and Hudson's Bay Company forces. 21 men died. Wars are fought over strategic resources. The fact that one of those resources was dried meat underscores its value as infrastructure rather than mere food. Modern military MREs are designed for a shelf life of 3 to 5 years under controlled storage conditions. They require multi-layer packaging, plastic, aluminum foil, oxygen absorbers, and still degrade faster than properly made pemmican, which remains edible for 2 decades or more without any packaging beyond the rawhide bag it was stored in. Bison are seasonal batteries. During summer, they convert grass, solar energy captured through photosynthesis, into subcutaneous and visceral fat stores. By late summer and early autumn, a mature bull can carry over 100 pounds of depot fat distributed across specific anatomical locations, each with distinct properties and rendering applications. The hump was not muscle. It was supported by elongated thoracic vertebrae but consisted primarily of fat and connective tissue. This hump fat was prized for its high yield and clean flavor. It rendered into a tallow with exceptional clarity and a melting point that remained stable across temperature variations. A bison hump could yield 15 to 20 pounds of rendered tallow from a single animal. Kidney suet, the hard fat encapsulating the kidneys, was considered the highest quality rendering fat. It had the firmest texture at room temperature and the lowest moisture content. This made it ideal for pemmican production because it solidified into a dense, brittle matrix rather than a soft, greasy one. The kidney suet from a single bison might yield 8 to 10 pounds of pure tallow. Back fat, the subcutaneous layer running along the spine, was softer and more variable in quality depending on the animal's age and condition. It was often rendered separately and used for applications other than pemmican, cooking fat, waterproofing leather, or fuel for lamps. The D-pillar, the thin subcutaneous fat layer across the entire hide, was carefully separated during butchering. Though thin, it represented significant total weight when collected from the entire animal. This too was rendered, though it produced a softer tallow than the internal depot fats. Long bones were cracked open, boiled, and skimmed to extract marrow butter, a fat so rich it was often consumed directly rather than rendered into pemmican. The process involved heating stones in a fire, dropping them into a water-filled container with the shattered bones, and allowing the kürtsot heat to liquefy the marrow. The fat rose to the surface and was skimmed off. This marrow butter had a soft, spreadable consistency and a rich flavor distinct from rendered tallow. The rendering itself required attention. The fat was cut into small chunks to increase surface area, then heated slowly in a rendering vessel, often a large metal pot or a lined hide container with heated stones. The goal was to maintain a temperature high enough to melt the fat and evaporate the water, but low enough to avoid scorching, which would darken the tallow and introduce bitter flavors. The process took hours. As the water boiled off, the connective tissue separated and floated as greaves, which were skimmed away. What remained was pure, golden tallow. This fat is not uniform in quality. Grass-fed bison tallow contains high concentrations of conjugated linoleic acid and maintains an omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acid ratio of approximately 1.5 to 1. This is anti-inflammatory. It supports cardiovascular function and provides fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K in bioavailable forms. The fat-soluble vitamin content is particularly high in autumn, when bison have been grazing on diverse prairie grasses rich in carotenoids and other phytonutrients. Modern grain-fed beef fat has an omega-3 to omega-6 ratio closer to 1 to 16. This is pro-inflammatory. The shift occurs because cattle are fed corn and soy instead of grass. Omega-6 fatty acids, abundant in seed oils and grains, promote inflammatory pathways when consumed in excess. Pemmican made from feedlot beef does not replicate the nutritional profile of historical pemmican, even if the preservation method is identical. The fat chemistry is fundamentally different. The timing of the hunt mattered. Bison harvested in spring, after a winter of depleting fat reserves, yielded lean meat with insufficient tallow for proper pemmican production. A spring-killed bison might carry only 20 to 30 pounds of total body fat. An autumn-killed bison could carry 3 to 4 times that amount. Autumn hunts captured peak fat composition. The entire process, from hunt timing to butchering technique to rendering protocol, was calibrated to extract maximum energy from the animal with zero waste. This is systems-level engineering. The bison was not just a source of meat, but a solar energy storage device, and pemmican was the technology for making that stored energy portable and indefinitely shelf-stable. Modern food preservation operates through sequential problem-solving. Fat is removed because it oxidizes, making the product dry and tough. Sugar is added to retain moisture and improve chewiness, creating a wet substrate vulnerable to Clostridium botulinum. Sodium nitrite is required to prevent botulism, but forms carcinogenic nitrosamines under heat. Actual smoking is too slow and expensive, so liquid smoke is sprayed on for flavor alone. Soy protein isolates and transglutaminase improve texture in restructured products made from meat scraps extruded through industrial nozzles. Tallow addressed oxygen exclusion, moisture barrier, and energy density simultaneously. It prevented oxidation by filling air gaps. It blocked humidity re-entry through hydrophobic encapsulation. It delivered 9 kilocalories per gram. It generated thermogenesis during digestion, producing body heat critical for survival in sub-zero temperatures. One ingredient performed multiple preservation and metabolic functions with no chemical dependencies. The result was a fuel source with a documented shelf life exceeding 20 years, requiring no refrigeration, no packaging, no preservatives. Modern jerky lasts 1 to 2 years in vacuum-sealed plastic, contains 10 to 25 grams of added sugar per 100 grams, and delivers 1/3 the energy per unit weight. The snap test still works. Bend a piece of modern jerky and it flexes. Bend a piece of properly dried meat and it shatters. That sound is the difference between water activity below 0.2 and water activity high enough to require sodium nitrite. It is the difference between microbial inhibition through physics and microbial inhibition through chemistry. It is the difference between a material designed to last decades and a product designed to last until the expiration date printed on the package. Blackfoot, Cree, Lakota, and Métis communities were not working with primitive technology. They were working with superior technology. We are the ones eating the downgrade.